All right. So just to get us started, you don't have to give like your whole resume or your whole life story, but just have some stuff here for you to give just a bit of context on yourself. If you could just give your full name, your age, where you're based out of, and I guess maybe talk a little bit about your experience, like researching games and sort of what activated you to pursue that. I know that games are a part of other stuff that you're looking at, but just for context here, just through that lens, that'd be great.
Sure. So yeah, my name is Christopher Persaud. I mostly go by Chris. I'm 25, and I am a PhD student at USC in communication. So let's see. Yeah, I mean, I got into studying games academically as an undergrad. I guess I think when I was a junior, maybe in college. Mostly because I realized that that was a thing you could do and that people did. So I basically Googled video game scholars and ended up learning that there was a person who did that at my university. So I literally just cold emailed them and was like, hey, can I do like research stuff with you and or take a class with you? And I did both of those things. That person was Adrienne Shaw at Temple. She's like a cultural studies communication scholar that mainly studies like video game communities like queer and trans like game players, and also queer and trans games, I guess. Um, yeah, so started as an undergrad. Among other things, I study games as part of my larger focus, I think, on like sort of new media and how it like relates to how people think about like subcultures, communities, identities, sort of how those things are often shaped by the media that we interact with. And I'm mostly like a qualitative games person, so not a whole lot of numbers going on in my research. But yeah, that's kind of the short version.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I am in that tradition of, other than asking about people's age in the very beginning, very few numbers tend to come up in these interviews, so I am there with you. So I'll try to also make sure we don't do any math or anything here.
Yeah, I can do math. I just don't love it, you know.
No, I can do math too, but it's that's kind of a bait and switch to be like, hey, do you want to do some long division? I know we said we were going to have a conversation about these things, but let's do some math. So let me see if I can reel this back in and regain your confidence here in the very beginning. So, I mean, as you said, yeah, like your work, as I understand it, you're exploring how media and communication technologies are, I think these are your exact words for it, are entangled with identity and pop culture. And so, I mean, I guess if it's even fair to summarize, based on your work so far and the things you're thinking about right now, like, in what ways do you feel like, how are video games sort of comparing to, the other fields that you're looking at or the bigger picture stuff that you're looking at, when it comes to things like ways they're struggling with regression, ways they're struggling with being more progressive? How do video games sort of stack up against other stuff you're looking at in this moment right now?
That's a great question. So I think what's interesting about games is that for a long time they were this like subcultural thing, that like nerds or computer hobbyists or like other people sort of did, and by that I mean I may be referring to like the 80s to 90s to early 2000s. And then at some point, and this is funny to say given that I was born in 1995, but from my knowledge of history, at some point in like the mid 2000s, games became a larger sort of pop culture phenomenon, maybe even the early 2000s. And then it was like, okay, so games are a thing that now everyone is doing, or that many different groups of people are doing, and sort of it's slowly starting to creep out of like the funny thing that like nerdy boys do culture, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think that sort of like shift, or at least that's one narrative you can tell about the history of games, but certainly that's like a popular one. And I think that has had some lasting effects as to just like constant debates about like who belongs in games, like who who is a gamer. Are you a gamer if you only play like casual mobile phone games versus AAA sort of titles versus like whatever platform you play on, whatever console you play on? Like I think those questions are just constantly coming up just because of sort of how games came to be a thing. Whereas maybe other media that I'm interested in, like social media and social media's intersection with like entertainment media, things like TikTok and of course when I think of examples my brain just dies. Things like TikTok or like Smash and sort of other small video platforms. I think that we're like it's sort of a question of time. So like right now I think social media is actually like not that old. And that's saying something compared to games, which are also not that old. Games are, the internet is about as old as I am, or at least the commercial internet. So I think that we're sort of in a period with other kinds of media where they're going to start going through, I think, a lot of these growing pains. And unfortunately, a lot of those growing pains in the case of Facebook are happening with perhaps the dissolution of American democracy. So yeah, whereas I think games have sort of started doing that a little while ago. And then like, as we know, about 5 or 6 years ago, Gamergate was a whole thing that I think was a manifestation of what I could diplomatically call these growing pains about sort of who belongs in games and sort of who gets to define what's important to the games industry and sort of games criticism. So yeah, I think that the difference is that games have started out from a place where it was always very concerned with who gets to belong, and then those questions sort of never really got resolved because honestly, I don't think that's ever really a thing you can resolve. Whereas other forms of media, new media, I think are starting to grapple with those questions on a much larger scale and have not yet. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Larger scale, how?
I would say that many more people interact with different kinds of social media than maybe the people that play video games, if that makes sense. Which is to say that the spillover effects of Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or insert social media platform globally, I think, in terms of how it shapes culture, are perhaps larger. Like on a larger scale, that's what I mean. But at the same time, I think what's really interesting is a lot of the like political discord and like sort of just polarization and all of that. I think a lot of the strategies used by perhaps some of different groups in sort of using like Facebook for disinformation and misinformation stuff. We actually saw a lot of that happen in like the sort of broader games and like nerdy internet culture. What's the word for that? Ecosystem, I guess. Maybe starting from like the mid 2000s into the 2010s. So I think that's interesting, and I think that's like I don't think that's a very popular point to make, at least academically, because it forces, I think, a lot of people who study like misinformation, disinformation, propaganda to sort of realize that like the historical trajectory of a lot of these like of things like QAnon and a lot of the other like conspiracies, sort of like internet things that we think of as weird and crazy, and how could that happen, and how could people believe these things, and how could platforms be like used in this way to like promote all this stuff that maybe some people would say shouldn't be out there. I mean, it's like I think people in sort of the games and broader like nerdy internet culture, subculture world have been kind of been like, oh yeah, that's like 4chan has been a thing, and like all these other boards have been a thing, and like we've been talking about this for years. I mean, as someone who sort of grew up, like that was what the internet was for me to some extent. I mean, not that I was maybe a regular 4chan user, but that was always a part of what my internet landscape looked like as like a teen, kind of in nerdy internet culture spaces. So I think it's really interesting because like a lot of these things, even like Gamergate and stuff, was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That totally is completely unsurprising to me that all that happened. But it's weird because like I think that games get both sort of hyper-focused on for maybe certain reasons, like, oh, games are making people violent, which I'm glad that I think we've moved past that in popular culture. But in other ways get kind of ignored. I mean, all of the, like, sort of, I would say bad subcultural things that we see spilling out into political culture have also been happening for a long time in different spaces of the internet, including games.
I mean, it's been interesting to put it, I guess, diplomatically, it's been interesting to see what sort of the fallout of a thing like Gamergate has been, and sort of, I guess like other sort of nebulously related or similar things, like you mentioned, like 4chan and QAnon and other conspiracy theories online, and just sort of, I think for many people now, when they all that stuff, like the shorthand for all that stuff like that is the internet for them. Sort of the way those sorts of things, the way people sort of behave within those types of movements or boards, and it's interesting to hear you discuss it, because I'm flashing back on conversations I had, I guess maybe last year at some point, with people maybe 10 years younger than you, or I think even more than 10 years younger than you. So thinking like, kids who are 12, 13, or 14, and sort of, it's difficult to discern like the degree to which it might just be a kid in an interview speaking with an adult about these things, where like a lot of kids I was talking to, they were sort of describing they just had sort of not only obviously different habits around the internet, but there was this sort of belief that among kids that all grown-ups are crazy about this stuff, if I can speak broadly. And I guess I wonder, to what degree, is that true? Is there a way in which, things like Gamergate are invoked and you feel like, well, maybe too much importance is placed on it? Like, is it already been subjected to revisionist history in some way? I understand that like these things are not monolithic, and indeed the way people talk about them aren't monolithic, but like, are there certain types of subcultures or certain types of people in subcultures you notice who, I don't want to be reductive and say like, oh yeah, they're totally crazy about these things, to quote the kids, but a way in which like it may be possible, we didn't learn the lessons we could have.
Yeah, what's a good, that's such an interesting, it is crazy talking to, well, it is such an interesting experience talking to, like, people that are younger than me, because, right, like, all of the people sort of, I would say, that are big players in, like, this, what do we do about the internet space, are all consider me to be a kid, given that I'm 25, so it's fascinating to
right.
Younger than me think. Anyway, but, yeah, one of the biggest lessons I think of this is that, like, Gamergate is such an interesting, like, sticky object, I guess, which is to say that, like, it kind of, I think, just gets leveraged by whoever's speaking about it in a way to, like, justify whatever argument they're trying to make. I think I've shied away from maybe making Gamergate, like, a sort of just totalizing, like, yep, everything can be explained if you just, like, look at Gamergate and, like, would have listened to people yelling about Gamergate, but at the same time, like, I think there is, like, I don't know, I was in college, right, when Gamergate was happening, and a lot of the, like, sort of, I would say, internet battleground that led to it, like, all of that stuff was kind of set in motion, like, to use, like, more temporal reference points when I was in, like, high school and in, like, late middle school, so it's, like, I think that Gamergate, I think, is more of a, like, boiling point of things that have been happening for a while, and I think, and I think similarly, what we're seeing with, like, QAnon and sort of other, like, new media-enabled sort of conspiracy and other, like, I don't even know the word for it, because misinformation, I think, is not even quite, like, a great word to describe all of this, but sort of just whatever we're seeing in the information ecosystem, I think, again, is not, like, shouldn't be treated as, like, look at this exceptionally bad thing that happened because of X, Y, reasons about new media and social media. Like, yeah. I think that, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, it's more of a, like, here's, like, sort of a, like, exceptional case of, like, a longer pattern of things that have been happening. I mean, like, people have been decrying filter bubbles and, like, being stuck in your, like, information silos about social media for quite a while. So, yeah, I think it's, like, more useful to think about things like Gamergate or things like QAnon as, like, the result of, like, a longer term sort of thing, as opposed to, like, exemplarily weird things that we can't explain and can only explain by, like, invoking these, like, wild and crazy sort of explanations.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I don't know how it does. Yeah. I mean, but for people following along, I hope so. No, I mean, I think about this stuff a lot of the time. and so I don't know how, kind of cliche or like, kind of boring it is for you to be asked questions like that, but it's sort of an interesting thing, I think, when you're in front of a person or talking to a person in a non-online context, to sort of to be human to human and just sort of hear like, well, I think you think about these things a lot, and so what do you think about the way you notice other people tend to think about it? So like, yeah, I don't know, but I mean, to sort of, because it can sort of be a black hole of discussion, maybe still in 2020, yeah. And I would be much more interested to hear, with the work you're doing, like, what is on your mind, like right now in this moment, or what are things that are sort of bugging you about the way that other people may be, quote unquote, crazy in their understanding about things?
I mean, I guess, first of all, I don't mind. I mean, I think every games researcher and journalist probably thinks that they'll have to talk about Gamergate at some point, so it doesn't bother me. But let's see. I mean, I have just been thinking. I mean, yeah, it's like kind of unavoidable. I mean, even if you're someone who I think tries to stay out of it, the fact that you try to stay out of it is sort of like is interesting, I think. But if that makes sense. Even defining yourself as not talking about it is like a position, but
right. It seems like some sort of statement, because like, yeah, okay, well, why do you need to broadcast that so clearly? Well, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean, even from my own position, right? Like, I mean, part of the work I do, like, I'm firmly a queer video game scholar, and it's not that I don't want to talk about Gamergate, I just don't think there's anything about it that I can say that it is productive or useful that other people haven't already said. But, right. Yeah, but yeah, I don't avoid it, I guess. I just don't think it's a very productive conversation, like you said, a lot of the time. But
sure.
Anyway, I mean, what else am I thinking about? I mean, these days I'm just thinking a ton about monetization, sort of like how people make money, or how people should make money, I suppose. Maybe that's the frame that I'm always thinking about it in. So like more, I guess broadly, like a lot of my work beyond sort of just the game stuff is I'm really interested in sort of like this idea of the content creator and like how, like what that even means, like where did that phrase even come from? It seems like such a like, maybe the last 4 or 5 years. Like obviously YouTuber and like even to some extent Instagrammer or like influencer have sort of been framed, like words that have framed particular relationships to like making money on the internet for a little while, but I'm just so fascinated by how content creator is now just this like catch-all for anything from like indie porn performers, which is what some of my work focuses on, to like people who, I don't know, are like fitness people on Instagram that now are like basically trying to make a living because gyms aren't open in most of the country.
Yeah.
So, Twitch streamers, like I'm just so fascinated by the like slipperiness, I guess, of that term. But anyway, even games journalists, I mean, like the fact that I think one of the questions you asked me was like, how is games journalism going to keep happening given that like there's not a lot of money for people to make a living and like keep doing it. Anyway, so yeah, I'm always thinking these days about how people make money, and even though I guess I said I don't think about numbers that much, maybe a better way of putting it is I'm always curious about how people think about how they should make money and how they think about how the platforms that claim to be able to help them make money, like Patreon or OnlyFans or insert thing. Like I'm really interested in sort of what happens, like the gap between how people think something should work and how the thing actually works, I guess. That's like kind of what a lot of my work most basically I think is interested in, sort of how people think about technologies and media and sort of what actually happens sort of on the ground, I guess. But anyway, so yeah, thinking about monetization, thinking a lot about like how do people make money in sort of our like new and social media ecosystem. When it comes to games, I mean, like I think I'm doing some work on Twitch streamers, specifically like drag queens who stream on Twitch, and I think like people who know nothing about Twitch, or even people who know nothing about drag queens, always ask me, they're like, so is this like, are they making a lot of money? Like, what is it like? And then they're like, oh, so they're like esports people, because that's the frame that people have for, Twitch streamers. Is that you're like an esports professional. So it's really interesting to kind of be in what I would think of this like small or mid-tier creator space, thinking about how people are trying to, in some cases, trying to actually make a living, in some cases supplementing their quote unquote whatever their normal job is with like content creation, again, whatever that means.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm with
so
you.
that's kind of where I'm at. Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to games, I'm just always fascinated about that.
So where do you find, I mean, I guess this would need to be qualified in some way, but I'd be curious to hear, like, where the biggest disconnects around those perceptions are, because I guess we would need to define whose perception and whose perception of whom. So maybe rather than try to act like it's all one thing, I mean, what are maybe you kind of struck by in terms of, like, who has the biggest disconnect or who has the most surprising disconnect when thinking about these things? I guess maybe it would make most sense to drill down into Twitch, since that's something that's already on your mind. But I don't want to relegate you to talk about quote unquote video game stuff if that's not the example that comes to mind if you're thinking about broader internet things.
I think I can maybe do both. So I guess when it comes to Twitch, I think, so a funny thing about being, so I'll give a little bit of background. In the United States, there's almost nowhere that you can get a graduate degree in video game studies. There are lots of video game design, sort of game design programs, but it's quite difficult to find a program that actually will like teach you how to study games critically. So what happens is that you have people like me who end up in communication or information studies, whatever. So the context for that is that there often are very few people at any like research university that has a graduate program that knows anything about video games. So what that means is I spend a lot of time, I first have to explain what video games are, which sounds silly in 2020, but I mean, it's totally still a thing. Then I have to explain like what it means to like make money from like being a video game content creator. So being a Twitch streamer or someone who posts on YouTube or, any sports person, like that's still quite, that's not, I would say that's not as like popularly understood, I think, as people who are, in games would think. So kind of start there. Just think about Twitch. I mean, just to professors, to other graduate students, even to like people who work in, because I live in LA, right? People who work in entertainment media, like the idea that you can make money streaming yourself playing a video game, like building an audience, even for people who understand like influencers or content creators in other contexts, is still just like a weird thing. So that's kind of, so the gap there is like, I have to start with a yes. People can, not many, make quite a lot of money streaming on Twitch. Most people, like with all internet content creation, there's like a handful of people who make a lot of money at the top, and then there's many, many more people who make maybe a little bit to a medium amount, and then like a ton of people who make nothing, kind of at the bottom. So I think that, so trying to get people to understand that like the outliers they read profiled in the New York Times or whatever, like are not actually representative, I would say, of most people's experiences, either as like a viewer, like as an audience member, or as like a creator on Twitch or something.
Yeah,
does that make sense? Yeah, like I mean, people know the esports people, like like people can like think about Ninja or even Tyler One to some extent, but
yeah. No, I mean it absolutely makes sense. I think on both fronts. To me, anyway, I would be curious to hear like. Because I think we're down some adjacent rabbit holes here just in what we both do separately. And so I am curious. It does not surprise me at all to hear, although I don't think I've been in a conversation where I've had to explain what a video game was. I certainly have often been in rooms and conversations about the work and the work I want to do where I don't know if it's like skepticism is quite the word, or if it's sort of the skepticism people would have about any work at all. Like I often feel like to explain, with these interviews and sort of what I'm doing, like when it's in a context that's not someone to interview for it, I feel like I often need like, well, it would probably be helpful if like I had a conversation with that person before, just so I have a frame of reference for what their frame of reference is, so I can sort of translate it for them. Which I don't know how interesting it is to discuss that, but I would be curious to hear like, how do you sort of navigate that? And because I think that's largely lost for whatever it is we mean by video game culture, that there's a huge part of the world who doesn't think about this stuff, doesn't realize they can think about this stuff, and actually may not want to think about this stuff. So how do you sort of navigate them to like explain like what it is you're doing or what it is you're interested in doing, if you're starting from, from zero, basically? Sorry, I was trying to avoid numbers also.
No, it's okay. That's a great question. I mean, so I'll start by saying, I'm a baby academic, so of course I love meta thinking about thinking, I guess. That's like an important side of the whole thing. But, I guess a great way to put it is that, like, I'll use an example of, like, some of my classmates, right? Like, I have classmates who are also, in their mid-20s, maybe late 20s, early 30s, who played video games at some point in their lives because, whenever they grew up, that was a thing that people did at some point, but who sort of, like, you can just, like, see it when I, like, start to, like, talk about what it is that I do or what I'm interested in, not in, like, a dismissive way, but they just fully don't really quite connect that, like, this, like, type of media that lots of people, like, spend a lot of money on, spend a lot of hours playing, do all these things, also, like, has its own culture and, like, has many cultures. And when people say, like, video game culture in the United States, usually they're signaling a very narrow, sort of specific thing that is, like, sort of your stereotype of, like, a 17-year-old, like, straight white boy screaming in his room, like, with a headset on, but that's actually not... one thing I think I always start with is that is actually not, like... That is not all video game culture is, if we could even, like, say that. And even if it was, I think it's way more interesting to start from the position that, like, okay, if that's, like, the dominant understanding of what video game culture is, why is that? And, like, who created that narrative? Like, who gets left out of that? Like, so those are the kinds of questions that my work somewhat engages with. And then also, like, in other forms of media, but we're specifically talking about games. I would say that it basically starts with being, like, assessing, like, where someone's at. Like, did you play Super Mario when you were a kid? Like, what, like, what, like, where are you coming from when it comes to games? Then what's really interesting is that there are a lot of people who play games who don't identify as, like, a gamer, and that's always a fascinating sort of encounter.
Well, as we touched on, that can be sort of, that word has baggage, especially after the last couple of years, especially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But what I mean is, like, what's interesting is it's people who, I think what's interesting to me is people who don't identify as a gamer and their reason. So totally for some people it is the, like, Gamergate, all those things, the bad parts of internet culture, quote unquote. But for some people it's just like, it doesn't occur to them that their, like, engagement with an entertainment media like video games could be something that's constitutive of their identity. Like, that's just not a, like, they view, like, I read books, I play games, I listen to music, right? That's not a, for some people that's not, like, a thing that they sort of, like, build their sense of self around, which I find fascinating as someone who, over different periods of my life, totally did, at different points, like, identify as a gamer. It was very important to me that, like, that was, like, sort of a starting point for how I relate to other things, and maybe now as, like, a young adult who, sort of professionally studies games in some context, I don't know if it's really important to me to figure out how I identify in terms of whether or not I'm a gamer, but yeah. That's always interesting. Running into people who, like, don't identify as a gamer and then the reasons as to why.
What do you think that is indicative of? I was thinking about it. I was thinking, is it because of the, I don't know, people use the word escapist a lot, but I was just thinking, is it because of the private or the ways in which playing video games, like you can be by yourself? And I was thinking, like, well, I don't know that I've ever heard anyone say, other than when it was new, their identity is they're an internet user or internet visitor or whatever the word is, netizen, as they used to say. But there are, like, smaller things, there are subsets within that where, they may particularly identify with, like, a certain social network, or, do you get a sense that, like, is it because of something like that? Because there absolutely are people who, like, they pick a video game series and that is sort of, that's the extent of their thing, like they play Destiny and that's it. And they kind of are not interested in anything else. But maybe that's assuming too much knowledge on the people who you're saying that about. Do you have any sort of even speculative sense of, like... why it either doesn't interest them or why it doesn't dawn on them, or maybe that's actually a healthier relationship now that I think about it.
Yeah, I didn't think of it that way. But, yeah, I mean, let me just create some, as we love doing in academic, like, let's create some cases. So I would say maybe there's, like, a person who plays, like, mobile puzzle games on their phone and does it, like, on their commute, so I guess none of us really have commutes anymore, and that's just, like, a thing that they do. So I think for that person, identifying as a gamer doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because to them, a gamer means that they spend, X amount of hours playing certain kinds of games, first-person shooters, MOBAs, etc., with like some sort of established group of friends that they regularly interact with. And certainly that definition of being a gamer is one that I think popularly a lot of people relate to. So maybe that's one reason, is that they just don't feel like they fit into the sort of the popular culture understanding of what a gamer is. Then, of course, like, case number 2, I think we understand pretty well, the people who, like, know what Gamergate is, have felt like that they don't feel included in whatever version of games culture that Gamergate sort of unearthed, I guess, or maybe made visible. Then I'd say the third case is the one that's much more interesting to me. So it's people who, not because they were explicitly told by, like, I don't know, some annoying teenage boy when they were in high school that they're, like, not a real gamer because they're, a woman, or because they're, like, Latino or whatever. Like, it's more the people that are, like, they just, like, view games as just, like, a broader part of their sort of entertainment media ecosystem. So, like, they listen to podcasts, listen to music, like, watch movies, whatever. Like, do they identify as, like, a cinephile? Probably not, So I think those people are so interesting to me, because I definitely go through phases where I might play only 1 or 2 games a lot, or play, lots of, like, little indie games that, you can, like, pay some person, like, $5 to download a copy of their game, things like that. So I'm definitely someone who I realize, and I would say this compared to other game scholars and journalists that I know, I actually don't play a lot of games, so that's always a fascinating, like, relativism thing, but compared to, like, quote-unquote a normal person, like, I know far more about video games than most people I think will ever want to know. So I think
you have all that time opened up because you're not playing all the time.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's always that's actually really funny. The assumption is that when people, like, learn, regardless of whether academics or not, that I like studying video games is the thing I do as a part of my life, they assume that, like, that also means that I spend all my time playing video games, when in reality I think I played video games more before I decided to go to grad school and, like, study them.
Yeah. No, it's been a similar thing for me, to the point of not like imposter syndrome or anything, but it's like, well, I try to stay as conversant as I can, but and maybe this is part of it for you too. Is like, well, I think about this stuff all the time, so I don't need to be saturated in it like all the time. And I think that's also like, well, there's different types of knowledge.
Yeah. What's funny is, like, not to ask you a question, but what's funny is, like,
you can. It's for game.
Yeah, I actually sometimes have felt like almost a weird, like, imposter syndrome, where I'm like, well, I don't play, like, because one thing is I tend to not study games that I play, just because I like to create some distance for myself between, like, always thinking about, like, that would make everything work, and I don't always want to, I don't want to do that. But I've often felt I have, like, a little bit of imposter syndrome sometimes, because I'm like, oh, like, I don't know everything about, like, the latest console and, like, the hot games that are coming out, like, tomorrow, or, like, I don't, like, I know a lot about things related to monetization, because that's what my brain is thinking about, so I've been following, like, the Epic Games situation, but at the same time, like, I couldn't name every single thing that Epic Games has ever done, Like, there's an interesting, like, where you feel like you can't know everything, but also feel like somewhat of an imposter because you don't know everything. And I don't know, is that something that you've thought about as a games journalist?
I mean, so my work on this came after, so I've been working in entertainment journalism for about 15 years, and so, like, I think there was, like, a solid decade before I started doing this particular line of inquiry, and I think I had like going into this, I had ideas of, like, certain outcomes or change I was hoping to help enact. And I mean, I don't know how directly it relates, but, like, I came to realize that, like, I mean, talking about the word gamer, like another word that sort of drives me up the wall can be the word industry when we talk about video games, because it's always not clear to me, well, what do we mean when we say that? And which industry, because there's actually 90 industries that comprise the thing that we say is capital I industry. And so I think I've really sort of settled into a mindset of well, under this guise of interviewer, I don't have to know everything. And it's okay for me to try to, I used to talk about this early on. I was like, oh, well, this is a quest to sort of illuminate, things I'm ignorant about within games and also get to sort of explore my curiosities. I don't think so much imposter syndrome, but I do think, and maybe this is your experience too, it's I feel like people want to ask, when conversations come up with people about this stuff, these interviews that I've been doing, people, I think it's reasonable. People want to be like, well, what have you learned doing this? I'm like, oh, God, my brain doesn't work that way.
No, suddenly I can't remember everything. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because I feel like the more I learn, I want to learn, but also the more I learn, I don't know. So I think if I was a know-it-all, I would feel like an imposter. But also, there's just, it's impossible. There's too much stuff. Never mind, the flow and the rhythm of information, online, like you and I doing this conversation, talking. Even if I knew everything, I now literally don't know anything that's been happening the last 35 minutes. So I actually don't know everything. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if that actually answers your question, but I feel like, I mean, it kind of relates to something I wanted to ask you about, which is are there ways in which the work you're doing, and we can get back to the thing we were talking about, I'm not trying to change the subject, but I was just sort of curious, are there ways in which, where you're housed right now, in an academic institution, are there ways you feel where, the work you want to do, your peers, instructors, et cetera, are there ways that, you probably don't have to explain what a video game is, but are there ways in which you feel people don't quite, understand or grok, what you're hoping to do, or maybe they misunderstand what you're doing, or maybe there's certain responses that seems to indicate oh gee, maybe this isn't a good fit in these very specific tiny ways, but I'll get back to this later, when I'm kind of sort of spreading my wings more. Is that a thing that you ever feel where you are right now?
Yeah,
ways where,
I mean,
yeah,
what you've described is, I think, what getting a PhD is like, to some extent. I think kind of always feeling like you're not quite explaining yourself or expressing yourself or in quite the way that you, in your head, think that you do, but also kind of, I think, learning to just be okay with that unfinished project of making sense to both yourself and other people is kind of a part of the process, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's so funny because when you're doing a PhD and maybe you want to be an academic or being an industry researcher, whatever you decide to do, you always sort of have to have these different one sentence, 3 sentence, 1 paragraph, page long explanations of what it is that you work on. And I think towards the beginning you quoted something that I think I wrote on my website that took, no joke, maybe that sentence where I write, broadly my work explores how media and communication technologies are entangled with identity and popular culture. It took me an hour to figure out what is the what is the 1 sentence thing.
Oh, I thought you were going to say. I thought you were going to say much longer than that.
Oh, well,
like months, if not years. I mean, because that is a thing too. Because right,
my whole first year, yeah, for sure. But
yeah. Because that's the thing is your work isn't static, but it builds on what you did before.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah. So definitely more realistically, it took me my whole first year, my PhD, to be what the hell do I actually what am I doing? But I mean, intentionally, I think the game is that you want to write, in my case, you want to write a sentence that is both specific enough that people have some idea as to what you care about, but broad enough that you don't have to keep changing it every 6 months when you decide that you want to do something slightly different or work on a slightly different object or whatever. So for me, I mean, I think it's I'm so not wedded to a particular, I'll never be a scholar of a particular kind of game or a particular company or a particular social media platform or a particular, even genre of media. Like, that's never just going to be a thing that's just not how I relate to, like, how my brain, I guess, consumes information. I'm always interested in, like, the connections between things that otherwise might seem unconnected. So, I mean, when I say that, like, for example, like, a big thing that happens is when I say that, like, I study queer media and cultural production, people assume that that means that there's, like, a particular, like, assume that means I study, like, marginalization, or assume that means I study inequality, or, like, when they hear I study video games, it's like things related to Gamergate and people being sort of not included in certain spaces, which is true. To some extent, those are things that I'm interested in, but to me, like, that also means that I'm really interested in just how, like, queer teens are using TikTok, or how, like, journalists write about, like, quote unquote queer media, what that is. Or when I say that I'm interested in video games and gaming cultures, plural specifically, because I'm really interested in, like, I don't know, like a collection of, like, teens who are going to college and decide they want to go to a school that has an esports team. Like, that's the video game culture. What's that about? Or, like, I don't know, the proverbial, like, suburban moms that play, like, Candy Crush on their phones competitively with each other. Like, that's also a gaming culture, So I guess I always am trying to, like, especially when I encounter people who don't think about games critically, or even, like, new media and social media generally critically, I'm always trying to get them to think about how things that they sort of take for granted are actually quite complex and not really one-dimensional, and also, like, are just so ever-changing. I think, which is what you mentioned about, like, in the last 45 minutes, I'm sure something ridiculous has happened in quote-unquote video games culture, and we're gonna learn about it. I mean, I'm always just interested in these, like, moments of sort of I hate the word disruption. I'm not going to use that. I'm interested in these moments of, like, shifting or changing how people think about things that they took for granted. So I think that's kind of, like, where my work starts from. Like, I love making people care about drag queens on Twitch. Like, I love making people who otherwise would never care about that in a million years, like, be like, oh, that's interesting.
So how do you find points of entry for people? Because that's very much, I think this may be the single best indication for me of, like, why I am not a know-it-all, is because I have instincts about how to try to find points of entry for people into these types of topics. But as I'm sure you can talk about, I always feel like a bit of a pompous asshole being like, well, there's really not a ton of that much of a template for trying to figure out how to translate this stuff to people who don't even think that they would want to care about this stuff. So, like, how do you, because what you mentioned, like, that's a very specific point of entry, right? So, like, how do you find points of entry for people who think they would have no reason to ever care about something like that? Like, is it a particular mindset you take in conversation, in writing, or none of the above? Are you still figuring it out?
I'm still figuring it out, but that's also just such a big, important part of, like, how I view what kind of, like, academic/researcher I want to be. So I'm always interested in, like, I don't know, academia seems to frame, like, certain things as public scholarship, which is to say, when you're not talking to other people with PhDs or people who are trying to get PhDs, you're doing public scholarship. Which is kind of that class you mentioned that my friend Steven is in, Public Intellectuals with Henry Jenkins, is, like, actually, I think, sort of a great anti-example of that sort of limiting frame. Because for Henry, from what I understand, because I've taken another course with him and sort of know him a little bit, like, almost everything he does as, like, a pop culture scholar is about sort of getting people to care about popular culture because it matters for insert any other part of life that they could think of. So
right.
I think for me, like, sort of, like, how I deal with, like, thinking about entry points into, like, well, for otherwise it could be described as very niche, like, subcultural interests to sort of broader audiences, is that I'm always like, okay, well, I don't know, if I'm talking to a communication scholar who, let me make up a caricature of someone who's, like, very, like, only does quantitative research, only cares about, like, health psychology, media effects, how to get people to stop smoking, I don't know. Like, if I'm talking to someone like that, and I'm like, oh, I'm studying how drag queens on Twitch, like, build community and sort of, like, negotiate aesthetic presentation because of all these reasons. I don't know. So I could start with me just going, okay, so it could be as simple as the internet, and then you have to sort of see where they're at with like what they think of the internet. Do they think of the internet as like a dynamic media space that can enable different kinds of cultures? If the answer is no, then maybe you have to go, okay, so on the internet, there are these things called websites. No, I'm kidding. But like basically you start with like seeing where someone's at in terms of just how they care about like maybe the object that you're interested in. So in my case, like Twitch. Like if someone knows nothing about video games and nothing about even influencers, so that's rare these days. And nothing about content creators, also rare these days. It's a little bit hard, but I think most people have a general sense because of the work that journalists for mainstream publications have been doing at what an influencer is. So I might be like, okay, so you understand that there are people who like get paid to sell, I don't know, sponsored products on Instagram. There are also people who like make money by like playing video games. What do you think about that? And then kind of just seeing sort of where we go from there. But it's always, I think, about connecting it to someone's like, I think whether or not I'm like teaching or writing or having casual conversation with people, I'm always interested in sort of seeing where people are at. So I think there's kind of not like there's no like formula. I don't know. I wish there was a formula of being like, if person says X, like I say Y, and then like, it'll all work out and they'll care about the weird things that I do. But no, I mean, I'm always just like trying to be mindful that like there's a million things that I know nothing about, and honestly that I probably don't care much about, unless I happen to encounter someone who explains it to me in a way that like resonates with however I think about the world. So I'm always trying to like just sort of dynamically figure out where people are at, I guess, especially like people in student context.
So how did you land on or start looking at drag queen Twitch streamers specifically?
I mean, to be honest,
get asked this question do you get asked this question every day?
No, but recently, yes, only because I'm starting to write up the project that I worked on over the summer with a friend of mine. Basically, the short version is that a friend of mine is a drag queen who streams on Twitch, who is also a sociology PhD student in Canada. So literally, like, at one point I was like, yo, we should, like, write about this. And he went, okay, and here we are. I mean, that's literally, like, what happened. I've as you can guess, I, like, watch Twitch streamers quite regularly, just recreationally, and have had known of people who stream in drag. But usually it was from the context of, like, people who are drag queens who occasionally stream on Twitch, as opposed to, like, what mostly the people that I've been studying with my friend Matt are people who, like, being in drag on Twitch is their, like, venue through which they do drag. So I think that's, like, kind of the interesting difference, I guess. So anyway, so the question originally just started out with, like, what's going on? Like, there are people who do drag, but they're not, like, they don't perform, like, live or in person back when you could do that before, coronavirus. They just do it on Twitch. Like, what's going on there? And I mean, that to me is just an interesting, it's a difference of setting, it's a difference of, like, the way that you, do makeup and, like, present yourself to be on video is different than what you would do if you were in person. So just questions of, like, how the medium affects, like, presentation was interesting to me. Like, what it meant to, I don't know, what it means to be, like, sort of a visibly queer sort of aesthetic representation on, like, a space that historically, is about gaming and gaming culture and sort of the long tail of gamer game. What that means, I mean, I think there are a lot of really interesting questions about how, again, this question of, like, who gets to be a gamer and what does it mean to sort of, like, what does it mean to, like, demand space for yourself in that definition, I suppose. Even if that's not the language, this is the thing that I hate that academics do sometimes, just, like, put words in other people's mouths. Even if that's not the language that people doing that thing would use, I think it is interesting to, like, to both for their audiences and for like, streamers to, like, think about how they frame certain things or why they do certain things. I mean, like, an anecdotal example of this is, I think, I've watched maybe 80 hours of streams over the summer of drag queens streaming on Twitch, and, like, there's some reoccurring themes of, like, their audience members talking about, like, oh, like, I love watching you, blah, 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 blah. Like, by the way, like, I started coming out to, like, friends and family the other day, and that's, like, a thing that people, maybe once a week I would notice that like was a discussion in like the Twitch chat, and like, you know, which is like beautiful and like a great thing that people can feel empowered to do. But it was so interesting that that was like a thing that kept like sort of coming up across like different channels, different people, or the idea that like drag queens on Twitch get like trolled quite often. Like that's, you know, a shitty reality of like being on a platform that, you know, isn't a walled garden where you can control necessarily who has access to your content. So I don't know, things like that. I'm really, and that's how I think like I would say to someone who doesn't care about drag queens or Twitch is that like these things are like microcosms of just bigger issues that we've cared about for other forms of media, or we've cared about for like socialization, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of my working theory, you know, that like all parts mirror, you know, all parts represent the whole, or they mirror the whole in some way. And so I've often felt that sort of in the way that, as you were talking about before, you know, in the 80s and 90s, just this sort of like cascading nature of just video games at large being marginalized and sort of them being covered as a joke or just sort of only interesting when they made a lot of money, and like, you know, the people being really into them being marginalized, and there's being this like, you know, this circular thing of like, well, we're marginalized and we're going to marginalize other people out and assert our dominance, and like, you know, I guess like arguably that sort of coming to a ahead, I guess, with something like Gamergate, which I think just largely like one of the benefits, if you could call it that, is like it gave a name to a thing that was like felt for a long time, but, you know, never quite articulated. And I mean, I guess I'm curious because like streamers, in a way, you know, there could be a generational thing even among people who are really into video games, where it seems like if you're over a certain age, you don't give a shit about streaming and you don't ever really intersect with it, and if you're under a certain age, you know, and also people over a certain age, they also think it's like really weird or whatever. But like, you know, so I guess I'm curious, like, in this, as you say, you know, in this niche sort of place that you're looking of drag queens on Twitch, like, how does, like, by digging into that, like, I don't want to ask you what does it mean, because I know that's the question you said you're asking, and obviously that's a thing we could easily do an entire interview on itself. But I'm curious, like what knowledge is sort of, if this stuff wasn't looked at, like what are things we might not know otherwise about whatever it is we mean when we say video game culture? Or, I mean, I don't know, in a way it's sort of absurd to ask, because it is that thing where you were saying about some people where it's part of their bigger entertainment diet. And so in some ways to, you know, like reinforce and act as if video games are like their own separate thing sort of confuses it. But I am curious to hear, and here's where the actual question is, like, just what knowledge is left on the table if you didn't do the digging that you did. Like, what were things you were really surprised to learn that you might not have assumed, thought, or even expected to learn?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was actually surprising to me is that I think people would assume that, like, if you're a drag queen on Twitch who, you know, has been there for a little while, has established maybe a bit of a follower base, that sort of you would be accustomed to being trolled, or sort of that like trolling would just be like a fact of life that you accept, and you just got to deal with it because that's, you know, I'm in games, I'm doing something in games, and like that means that I'm going to be trolled by people who are shitty. That's sort of like, I think that was an assumption that I had about what a drag queen's relationship to trolling would be. But what actually was really interesting is that some of the drag queens and their audience, like fans and audience members that I have been like observing / got a chance to talk to a little bit, have like sort of described that like just because something is sort of like normalized in quote unquote games culture doesn't mean that they themselves like internalize that as normal, if that makes sense. So it was actually really interesting to like listen to people describe that they sort of are both prepared to be treated shittily by certain parts of like broader gaming culture, but also that they weren't going to accept that that was just something that like they had to deal with, I guess. Whereas like, which is to say that they, you know, would have like volunteer mods that like worked really hard to like instantly remove people when they started posting shitty things in the chat, or like when, you know, some other streamer who I would stereotypically say was a part of like the normative straight white boy Twitch world would like go like direct all of their followers to go join someone's like stream and just say shitty things, like people wouldn't accept that as like the price of doing business, I guess. So it's been interesting to see how in some cases with like stream teams that are, you know, relatively new on Twitch, that people have started sort of like basically telling Twitch like, we're not just gonna let this be a thing that we just get used to, like you need to do something about it. So, which I think maybe in a pre-Gamergate era, I think it would have been harder, I think, to be able to articulate that there were certain things that were bad, that were normal, but that you didn't want to be like treated as like okay, if that makes sense. So that was surprising.
It does. Well, and I think, I mean, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I'm just summarizing. I think that's just surprising. It was just seeing how much sometimes people like would both accept that something would happen, but didn't want to allow that to be like brushed off as like normal or like unproblematic, I guess, that it happened.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I mean, I don't think progress ever looks quite the way that like we want it to or expect it to. But I feel like, you know, what you're describing, if I'm understanding it correctly, like that's such a good way of putting it, and I think that's like a healthy sort of next milestone is like, you know, something that's considered normalized isn't being internalized as normalized, but like, you know what I mean? Like, in other words, like it's sort of a rejection of the status quo that can sometimes be incorrectly perceived as being somehow neutral just because, you know, oh, that's just the way it goes and that's the way it's been. But I mean, obviously talking about something like Twitch, who is a platform holder, are there ways in this work that you've been doing, like Twitch's, I don't know, I mean, like, are there ways, like, I guess I'm just curious, like, how does Twitch fare with this group of streamers that you're talking about? I mean, are there ways they could, like, assert stronger ownership and be better nurturers? Because there's this weird way, even in the last month or two, even in the last week or two, you know, just sort of game companies or platform holders as well sort of keep stumbling on whether they feel any responsibility to look out for their people, you know?
Yep. Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, yeah. I mean, most recently with like whether or not a game company will make a statement about Black Lives Matter has been interesting. But I think I think with Twitch, I mean, over the summer, right? Like a really cool thing that happened was that some of the more popular drag queens on Twitch were sort of like featured on like the front page a couple times, or like were sort of intentionally put at the top of certain like algorithmically generated lists as a part of Twitch's like, I think Twitch had like Twitch Pride or something during the summer. Or like Pride on Twitch, something like that, whatever. Yeah, so they were intentionally promoted by Twitch, like to sort of, and I would say in a way that like people were a little nervous about, right? Like, okay, like you're a popular drag queen on Twitch within the bounds of like people that watch drag queens on Twitch, but now you're being promoted to all of Twitch. Like that is going to have different like audience competition. Yeah. But I mean, by and large, I think that went mostly fine. So I mean, that's kind of nice, for lack of a better word. Like, yeah. Well,
I mean, you mentioned there being trolling, and so I mean, I think Twitch has made some changes, but I have heard about, you know, people, you know, because Twitch is so public and you don't need to like pass a background check or whatever, right. You know, to be on Twitch. I mean, I've heard of things where like, you know, people on Twitch sort of talking about, you know, coming out with like, you know, sexual misconduct allegations or harassment allegations, or talking about times that they've been abused in certain ways, and it's sort of either falling on deaf ears or it not really leading to much, or I mean, you know, it's tough because I don't think Twitch, even in its previous iteration of you know, just being Justin.tv or whatever, like I don't think being sort of the referee for things like this, like I often wonder, if it's, I think it's very disappointing, when companies make it clear, like this sort of attitude, like, well, you're sort of on your own. But I mean, do people sort of expect too much in terms of like platform holders to intervene? And I guess we could sort of abstract out here, not just from Twitch, but also like social media as well. I mean, I think we see, Twitter like rolling out some changes or being willing to experiment with some arguably pretty basic functionality that maybe they should have had when they launched.
Yeah.
But I guess I just wonder, is it reasonable or unreasonable? Although I think it's understandable the degree to which people, want platform holders to have there be fewer fires, I guess, just to put it kind of diplomatically.
I mean, I'll just paraphrase much smarter people who've spent much longer thinking about this than me, but I think that the question of what platforms should do, I think really depends on like what platforms actually are in public life. So I think certainly at one point Twitter and even Facebook were, like places on the internet that people could use for a very particular purpose, which was, I don't know, in Facebook's case originally socializing with other Ivy League college students.
Right.
But when Facebook became the public forum, the marketplace, the political sort of discussion board, access to insert miscellaneous piece of information about any place you could possibly be in the United States, much less the world, I think then the stakes sort of are a little bit higher in the sense that a paper that I published a little while ago basically was about how people's experiences disconnecting from Facebook, like what that was actually like. And what was really interesting is that we learned that for a lot of people, even the act of this is kind of like the Gamergate thing, even the act of not being on Facebook was still like a political and technological position in relationship to Facebook. So like even if you were someone who didn't use Facebook, that means that you were positioning yourself in, the 2019 at the time ecosystem, like information ecosystem, where you now didn't have access to like certain things. So concrete examples of this are like there are schools that are using Facebook as like the platform to communicate with teachers and parents and students. Like there are, communities of like freelancers where like they get job leads on Facebook. Like so I think it's a question of like, yes, on one hand, like private platforms, because of the way especially our internet law is written, like don't have to do certain things. But when I think platforms start looking a lot more like public utilities, I think then that raises different questions about what we should expect them to do. And honestly, I mean, one argument is that maybe Facebook shouldn't be Facebook. Maybe like Facebook should be 12 different smaller things that can actually be regulated. I mean, that's
right.
That's certainly one way to go. Yeah.
It's all, I mean, I think it's tricky too because sometimes or oftentimes, I guess, these types of platforms, and I think it's true game stuff too, like they sort of are, they're sort of able to grow to the point of having so much influence, power, and sway, because so, but I don't know, because I come from a journalism background, so I may be overstating or I'm trying to abstract myself away from thinking like whether that, because I think it had been at one point, a much more dominant channel in sort of influencing things itself. But like when it comes to tech in general and games as well, a lot of the writing historically is couched in like advocacy, like in other words, like, hey, this thing is cool, less so than like, hey, this thing is cool, but there might be problems. or the problems seem to only get written up where, like a journalist who was a huge proponent of Twitter, let's say, oh, this is so cool, blah, 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 and then fast forward 5 years later, oh, Twitter is horrible because this horrible thing happened to me on Twitter. And it's like, well, so, I mean, I guess it's sort of a segue into like, gosh, this is such a broad phrase, but like, with the work you're doing, I mean, like, what do you feel is sort of the state of like culture journalism, which is hyper broad and hyper abstract? I mean, I guess if I'm asking like how you feel about it, when you read things published in outlets, I guess the question is like, how often, like, are you more interested than you are irritated at stuff you read, or are you more irritated than interested?
Yeah. What do I think
maybe
about
that's an unfair maybe that's an unfair binary, but I feel like
that's okay. I mean, it's well, I mean, I think like for context, I guess, given that I'm now a PhD student in the School of Communication and Journalism, I think I'm learning a lot more about journalism, how journalism works, just sort of indirectly.
Which, to be clear, is why I was asking you, or why I was planning to ask you that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, but it's funny because I would say that like what's fascinating is that how do I put this without it sounding bad? There aren't a lot of opportunities that you might expect for me to formally learn about what journalism is and how it works because I'm not a student in the journalism program. If that makes sense. So
it does.
I think what's really interesting is my perception of journalism prior to starting graduate school in a school of journalism to some extent was mostly just obviously about like the things I read, maybe following certain journalists on Twitter who I've learned that I like their takes, for lack of a better word, on things.
I'll allow it.
Cultural journalism in particular, I feel like is so fascinating because I think the average media consumer doesn't understand the difference between a reported story and like editorial / opinion stuff. I think one, which I know that journalists have a lot of feelings about, but I'm not sure that. I mean, this is like I could be like talking out of my ass right now, but I'm not sure that the average media consumer like actually even understands like how journalism works, like at a mechanistic level, like what reporting is. No, you're like what. Yeah.
Being on the supply side for over a decade, I can tell you, you are talking out of your mouth. There, you're absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
But I think it's part of bigger patterns of like us as individuals, at least in this culture, being disconnected from production and supply chains for the things that we engage with on a daily basis. It's like you think about things like labor issues in video games. Like, yeah, that's sure, but that's true. Like it hasn't been reported on a ton. But like, when was the last time somebody was like sitting around thinking about like, well, I wonder about the people who made the ink that I put in my printer. Like,
right. Yeah.
I think it's part of a bigger pattern that, but I think it is absolutely true that. People don't have a clue, and I guess part of it is because like they've historically not, and I think that like it's changed or trying to change because of the internet and like the whole like we'll pivot to video, that will save everything, like that perhaps predictably has not borne out. But
yeah, and of course pivot to video was because certain platforms said that was what media organizations should do because it would be profitable for everybody, and
right.
But
well, and Facebook was a factor too, and yeah.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, that's. And then we found out that Facebook was inflating their metrics by what, like 400 or 500% of actual video watches or something.
That's within the margin of error, though. I think 400%. Don't you think?
Yeah. If only people weren't laid off for that margin of error. But yeah. I mean. So I think what's really fascinating about even the question of culture journalism is I think it gets back to this just broader like thing that like is always on my mind about like taking seriously that like arts and entertainment are like cost money, and that like there are people that like it is their job to make art or to make entertainment or to make journalism. Like that's like a thing that people do because they need to feed themselves. So I mean, or not that they do because they need to feed themselves, but by which it is the avenue that they turn their labor into money to live. And I mean, I think that's like, I think to some extent, some of the fault of people not understanding journalism or video games even is because it at some point it was like advantageous for people to think of journalism or video game development as like this like obscure black box thing that like you had to like be trained by the right people or work at the right places to understand. But of course we're seeing sort of the other side of that coin, which is that if people don't, and the same thing for academics. I mean, academics have spent decades, not hundreds of however long, like basically cultivating a particular identity about like what the work they do is and how it matters and how like quote unquote normal people shouldn't expect academics to be able to explain what they do to non-academics, but also two, that like that's not the point of the whole thing that they're doing in the first place. And I think journalists and a lot of tech workers and games industry people also do some version of that too. Which isn't to say it's always like, the poor person who is just trying to like freelance enough to pay their bills, but I think that it's like a question of like where we see culture mattering, and that's such a weird meta thing to say because we've been talking about culture for so long, but like where does culture matter, I think, in our broader like in our society, like we live in a society, I guess. It's telling that people find it difficult to imagine that we should, for example, pay to subscribe to newspapers, but like at the same time, like it would be insane. So I guess some people do feel this way about music, to say that like I should pay to go to a concert, like
yeah.
I think that there's something there about like having people feel like they have some like actual relationship to the thing they're reading or consuming or whatever.
Well, yeah, and let me know if this is too far afield to talk about journalism further, but like I've often wondered. Well, actually, maybe not, because you indicated earlier on. So, all right, I'll feel less bad about asking you this. But like I've often wondered, like why do we have a lack of like paywalled video game sites or paywalled sites that cover video games? Because I feel like you look around and like there's certainly enough audience in things like merchandise, et cetera, to suggest that like it wouldn't be impossible that like certainly, or I don't know. I mean, do you feel like you have an insight into that just by looking at Twitch? Because I think in a way it's weird, because I feel like people, like many writers I know, many people who've covered games for a long time, they sort of feel like they've been supplanted by streamers, by YouTubers. And then I think it's interesting to ask, like, okay, well, if that's true, then in what ways are they not carrying coverage forward? And so it would seem to me like, okay, well, we've seen this track record of like, journalists who have broken off. Sort of, I think before the rise of Twitch, there was a couple things, like a couple journalists breaking off, being like, hey, do you want to crowdfund our next big thing we're going to do? And I think there were a couple where people made a bunch of money, which doesn't indicate that's going to happen for everybody, but it indicates like there's an interest in that sort of thing. And then sort of like, streamers and YouTubers have sort of taken center stage, but arguably, they're not often doing journalism or news, but it's indicating, again, people like, some of the streamers you mentioned, like those aren't going to be the norm either, but it indicates that like, hey, there can actually be, money there. And so I just wonder, like, well, okay, well, does the pendulum, could it swing the other way? Could we see a thing like a paywalled video game site? Or is that just like a fever dream? Or, I mean, do you feel like you have any insight into either like why you think we haven't seen that, or do you have any insight from you're looking at Twitch, like whether there actually would be an interest in that? I'm not asking you to approve a business plan or anything like that. I'm just sort of, there seems to be a lack of a thing that seems to exist elsewhere in culture and in journalism, but it's like.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess everyone's pivoting to their own like subscription Substack now or whatever. That's a good question. I mean, I think in a weird way, the shift towards like the subscription, like freemium model that a lot of games have, been staking their whole existence on, Fortnite, League of Legends, etc. Like that's sort of training people to like pay small amounts of money over a long period of time for a thing that they enjoy. But I do wonder if it would be difficult to establish something like that. Even like, pay $1 a month to like read this game journal, because I think it comes back to people don't view information or carefully curated information or reporting as like a material good to which they like should pay someone for the labor of putting together for them. Because I think that's the sort of sticking point, and I think to some extent the average games consumer, like, maybe would be a little bit more, and I'm thinking of the games consumer being someone who, like, plays sort of games already that have, like, microtransactions built into them, might be able to sort of wrap their head around, like, paying small amounts of money over a long period of time for a games journalism product, but I think it's a hard sell because, I mean, it's hard enough getting people to pay for journalism generally right now. So then when you get into like a subculture like gaming, I don't know. It seems difficult. I mean, I think that it might have to be combined with like, for lack of a better word, having interesting people who are not games journalists also on said platform doing things. So having like entertainment video creators or whatever, or like streamers, I guess, affiliated with some sort of hypothetical platform. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the not to be really meta about this, but I think like the questions that we ask of why certain things don't happen in games. I think I said this in my email response to you. Like a lot of the anxiety I think we have about games journalism and games criticism is also just true of culture journalism in general. Like having people feel like they should pay for lack of a better word, pay to read about culture, I think is just so hard.